Tony Geist has published widely on 20th century Spanish and Latin American poetry. More recently, he has translated the work of a number of poets and has turned his attention to visual studies, including photo essays, art exhibits, and documentary film. He considers himself fortunate that two of his greatest passions, poetry and the Spanish Civil War, are also his profession.
My name is Tony Geist. I'm pleased to be here today to share my research and my teaching with you. My research follows three basic lines. One is contemporary Spanish poetry. The second is art and literature of the Spanish Civil War. And the third and a more recent interest is translation, literary translation. My interest in Spanish language poetry, principally Spanish Peninsular poetry, 20th century, involves the generation of 1927, generation of Lorca, Alberti, Salinas, Guillén, Cernuda, the so-called Silver Age of Spanish literature. And I'm currently finishing a book on surrealism in the generation of 27. It's tentatively titled The Ideology of Form, Surrealism in the Generation of 1927, in which I do an ideological reading of the 5 canonical works of Spanish surrealist poetry by Alberti, Lorca, Cernuda, and Vicente Alexandre. Surrealism in the evolution of Spanish poetics, 20th century Spanish poetics, is often considered the final windless gallery of the avant-garde, which it is. But I attempt to read these 5 works in a way that reveals the ideological underpinnings that will lead to compromiso, to engagement, to politically and socially engaged poetry, which will happen with these same poets in the 1930s. I also, following that same line, work on post-Franco poetry. First in the 1980s, when a group in Granada arises called La Otra Sentimentalidad, which later, a few years later, by the turn of the century, will become the dominant trend in Spanish poetry, contemporary Spanish poetry, and known as the poetry of experience, Poesía de la Experiencia. Luis García Montero is probably the leading poet of that group. And then more recently, I've been working on a group of poets from the 21st century who published in 2011 an anthology called Poesía ante la incertidumbre, which is a very interesting grouping of young Spanish and Latin American poets. So in addition to that, one of my abiding passions over the years has been art and literature of the Spanish Civil War. I have curated several exhibits, one of them a collection of children's drawings from refugee colonies during the Spanish Civil War. And I also did, a few years ago, a documentary film on the Abraham Lincoln Brigade called Almas Sin Fronteras, Souls Without Borders. I'm also increasingly interested in literary translation, specifically in the translation of poetry. I'm currently working on a project, a trilingual edition of Rafael Alberti's Roma, Peligro para Caminantes. I'm doing the translation into English of his poetry. My friend and colleague Giuseppe Leporace is translating him to Italian. And we're working with a photographer to do a large book. It's a very site-specific book, Roma, Peligro para Caminantes. And our concept is not that the photographs illustrate the poems, but rather that they dialogue with them. So in addition to that, my teaching in many ways follows these same areas of interest. For graduate seminars, I've recently taught surrealism in the generation of 27, and also a seminar on Luis García Montero y su genealogía poética, in which I'm more interested in how arguably the leading poet in Spain today, García Montero, constructs his genealogy rather than studying influences. I we work backwards, chronologically backwards, to see how he has chosen his predecessors. For undergraduate courses, I've recently taught Poesia y Música, poetry and music, as a way of getting American undergraduates to read poetry, which is not easy. And so what I've done is work with poems that have been set to music as a way of leading them to the poetry. Also art and literature of the Spanish Civil War, which I've done in a comparative context, a complete context. And currently I'm teaching a poetry translation workshop in which the students, we have 30 students, are translating the work of 4 contemporary women poets, 2 from Latin America, 2 from Spain, in which as they're working on their translations, when they come up with a pre-final draft, they are able to email with the poets and ask them questions and run their versions by them. So that's been very productive as well. So thank you for your attention.